Welcome to this episode of DIY3DTech.com. In this episode, we're going to kick off a small series entitled My First 3D Printer. So, one of the things about this time of year, I start getting a lot of questions about, hey, I want to get into 3D printing. I want to get my kid a 3D printer. I want to get my spouse a 3D printer. I don't know anything about 3D printers. Which one should I get? Blah, blah, blah. So, that's what this series is for. Now, we're not going to go in depth. This is, again, meant to be those people who have questions about 3D printing to sort of answer them. And I sort of vexed where to start. And I decided to start with PLA versus ABS. So there are two distinct printer directions to go. One is PLA, one is ABS. Now, there's a lot of printers that can do both PLA and ABS. But most will just do PLA. Should you start with PLA or should you start with ABS? So for those who have a short attention span, the answer is PLA. So if you're interested in why PLA, I'll tell you. So I started out with ABS. I bought a DaVinci. Bad move. So on the surface, the DaVinci looked like a good idea with its proprietary cartridges and supposedly the Apple of the 3D printing world. And all in all, the DaVinci was not a bad printer, but ABS is problematic. So ABS is basically a petroleum-based hydrocarbon type plastic. Now, I'm making this simple, guys, so if you're, plastics engineer out there, don't beat me up below. This is for the layman. Where PLA is basically cornstarch or some hybrid of cornstarch. This is biodegradable. This is not. Now, you kind of ask, what are the differences? What are the pros and cons? Pros and cons. PLA is more rigid than ABS. ABS tends to flex, where PLA will tend to break. It becomes very rigid. The other piece is temperature. PLA melts or has a glass point, which is the point at which basically a solid becomes molten, much lower than ABS. So with PLA, you'll see a glass temperature of about 180 to 200 degrees. With ABS, what you'll see is about 230 to 240 degrees. So what does this mean? If you leave something that's PLA based in a hot car in the summertime, it will probably deform because it is very heat sensitive. But on the other hand, this is a much easier to print with. Because it requires less of a bed temperature, it requires less temperature to print, and with that you have far less warpings and adhesion. One of the biggest things that you want to do is to get your part to stick to the bed of the printer. That is 99.8% of the challenge. ABS is very hard to do that. Some people recommend glue sticks. There's other adhesive products. All kinds of stuff. You mix this with a slurry, and pretty much you have to have a contained printer to do this. In other words, the printer has to be in a box, and the temperature of that box has to be raised. And you also have to have a very high bed temperature to do it. So you must have a heated bed, and it must be able to produce around 100 degrees C. And even with that, you're going to get what's called warping. Warping is where the edges of something pull up from the bed and basically deform your part. The majority of large parts you do with ABS will deform or warp. That is just the bane of this. This is good for smaller parts where you don't have a lot of surface area, things like that. The other thing, be forewarned about this does outgas fumes. Now, you can argue if they're good or bad. I'm going to say they're bad. Because one of the things, and I'll put the link down below so you can make your own decisions, while the hazard level of this is still in debate, at 400 degrees it breaks down into its constituents and is carcinogenic at 400 degrees. And you say, but Joe, I'm only printing at 230 degrees. Well, what this means is you're not going to outgas as much, but you're still going to outgas. Now, in an industrial setting, this isn't bad, but this is your home. This is your family and people around you. Was not designed to be a factory. And this is one of the big things you have to keep in mind, is your home is not a factory. And in my workshop, I have actually have power ventilation for my two ABS printers that are just dedicated to ABS, where I suck the air out and disperse it outside of the home. So I don't print with this inside the home per se. PLA, on the other hand, now you can argue some of the stuff with this. In general, it is considered far safer. I am not a medical doctor. I am not, but I'm just simply, I have looked at the MSDS sheets for both of these products, and on the surface, PLA has a reputation of being far safer from that. And you don't get as much warping. You will get some warping with this. It's inevitable, because what happens is the bottom and the top, the temperature cools at a different rate, and when that cooling happens, it wants to separate or pull apart. So this is why you get warping. So I wanted to kind of share this up front with you guys, because I think this is one of the most important pieces, because when I started out with ABS, I became very, very frustrated with it. Things didn't want to stick. Most of, probably 50% of my prints or more failed. And, one of the things, this is way back in the day, I've been doing this for about 3 years now. I watched Joe Telling, the 3D printing nerd, and he's printing all this big stuff, and I'm like, how's he doing this? It's not warping and it's an open, and then I figured out PLA. So, because when I started out, I really didn't know the difference, and that's why I'm starting out this series with this video, PLA versus ABS. And where I first got introduced actually to PLA was Angus over at Maker's Muse. He did a video on PLA and ABS, what are the differences. And again, I'm like, wow, if I would have just started out in PLA, my life would have been a whole lot better. I do 90% of my work actually with PLA. Only very, very limited work goes with ABS. Usually if I need a bit of flexibility in the product or resiliency, I'll go with ABS. But all my prototyping and everything else is done with this over here. Because most of the time when you're 3D printing something, you're really not doing it in a production setting. In other words, you're making a chess piece or a low poly Pikachu or something. It's not gonna, you're not designing it to last 10 years. And so again, I think that's why it's good to start here. Now in the future, if you get into it and you're like, hey, I really want to get into this 3D printing stuff, there's a lot of other filaments too besides ABS. Again, this is probably now my least go-to. I really like HIPS over this, over ABS, and I also really like TPU and PETG, or PETG as the kids call it today, are all, I think, better filaments than really ABS. So I do very little with ABS. So focus on, my opinion, if you're asking me, focus on a PLA-based printer and you'll be far happier. Anyways, Swag Shop's going to be coming up there. If you have questions about First Printer, hit me up in the comments below. Otherwise, subscribe. I do a lot of stuff on 3D printing, laser cutting, CNC, and there'll be a few more coming in this series to kind of explain a few other pieces about 3D printers, and hope to see you there. Cheers.
Please click like below and subscribe to the channel to keep up to date on all of our projects.